Arizona Territory, 1875. Dust swirled across the parched main street of Copper Springs as Colton Winslow tightened his grip on the reins of his chestnut mare. At 25, he had already built a respectable cattle operation out of nothing but grit and determination. His ranch, the Double W, represented everything he'd fought for since arriving in the territory 3 years prior. Independence, self-reliance, and the freedom that came with answering to no one but himself and the harsh desert that surrounded him. "You cannot keep avoiding this conversation, Colton," Judge Morrison called from the wooden boardwalk, his white beard catching the late afternoon sun. Colton adjusted his hat, squinting against the glare. The judge's summons had been clear, but he'd put it off for as long as possible. "With all due respect, Judge, I believe I can. My ranch is doing just fine without your interference. That land grant requires you to establish a proper homestead. The territorial governor is breathing down my neck about settlement requirements." The judge crossed his arms. "You have until the end of the month to find yourself a wife, or the Double W reverts to territorial control." Colton dismounted, boots hitting the dirt with a decisive thud. "The frontier is no place for a family, Judge. You know as well as I do that a man alone survives out here. A woman would just be a liability." The judge shook his head. "That's not for you to decide. The law is clear. Permanent settlement requires family establishment. The territory needs stable communities, not lone wolves." Colton's jaw tightened. He'd seen what happened to men who tied themselves to others out here. His own father had died trying to protect his mother during an Apache raid back in Texas. Attachment was weakness. Caring for others was a luxury a rancher couldn't afford. He'd built his life around this truth, and no territorial bureaucrat was going to change that. "I don't suppose you have any suggestions?" Colton asked sarcastically. Judge Morrison's eyes twinkled. "As a matter of fact, I do. Doc Miller's niece arrived on yesterday's stage from Boston. Sophia Miller, 24 years old and educated. Word is she came west after being passed over one too many times back east, what they're calling an old maid these days." He shook his head. "Ridiculous notion. The girl can't be more than half my age." "I'm not marrying some eastern bookworm," Colton protested. "Then you'll be looking for a new stretch of land by month's end," Judge Morrison replied evenly. "Your choice, son." That evening, Colton sat alone at the far end of the Copper Springs saloon, nursing a whiskey and contemplating his limited options. The Double W wasn't just land. It represented everything he'd built since escaping the memories of his family's slaughter. Every callus on his hands, every scar on his sun-weathered skin was testament to his belief that a man could only rely on himself. Now, some arbitrary rule threatened to take it all away unless he shackled himself to a stranger. "Mr. Winslow," a feminine voice interrupted his brooding. Colton looked up to find a woman standing beside his table. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a neat bun, though a few wisps had escaped to frame a face that was decidedly prettier than he'd expected. Her blue dress, though clearly well-made, bore the dust of travel. Despite her slender frame, she stood with a certainty that suggested stubbornness beneath her proper exterior. "Miss Miller, I presume," he said, not bothering to stand. "Sophia Miller," she confirmed, settling uninvited into the chair across from him. "My uncle mentioned you might wish to speak with me." Up close, Colton could see she was far from the dried-up spinster he'd imagined. Her eyes were a clear hazel, intelligence evident in their depths, and her complexion still carried the bloom of youth despite being what society had deemed past her prime. "Did your uncle mention why?" Colton asked bluntly. "He suggested you find yourself in need of a wife to maintain your land claim," she replied with equal directness, "and that I might consider such an arrangement beneficial, given my limited prospects." Her frankness caught him off guard. "You don't mince words, do you? I found that the frontier has little patience for social niceties, Mr. Winslow." A slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Besides, at 24, I've endured enough drawing-room conversations to last a lifetime. And you're willing to marry a stranger just to escape Boston parlors?" Sophia's expression sobered. "I'm willing to build a life somewhere I might be valued for more than my dowry or ability to pour tea." She leaned forward slightly. "I understand this would be a marriage of convenience, Mr. Winslow. I don't harbor romantic illusions." Colton studied her face, searching for signs of weakness or deceit. He found neither. Life on a ranch isn't easy, Miss Miller. There's no servants, no society gatherings. Just work from sunup to sundown. I'm stronger than I look, she replied. And I learn quickly. Something in her steady gaze made him uncomfortable, a determination that matched his own. I won't be changing my ways, he warned. I run my ranch as I see fit. I wouldn't expect otherwise. She straightened in her chair. I propose a trial period. 1 week. I'll come to your ranch and demonstrate my usefulness. If you find me inadequate, I'll return to town and seek other arrangements. Colton considered her offer. 1 week would at least buy him time to explore other options. And if we proceed with this arrangement, then we marry before the month's end. You keep your land, and I gain the freedom to build something of my own. She extended her hand across the table. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Winslow? Against his better judgment, Colton shook her hand. 1 week, Miss Miller. We leave at first light. The journey to the Double W took most of the following day, with Sophia perched atop the wagon seat beside him. To Colton's surprise, she neither complained about the rough trail nor attempted to fill the silence with needless chatter. Instead, she observed the landscape with evident curiosity, occasionally asking practical questions about water sources or local plant life. As they crested the final ridge overlooking his property, Colton felt a familiar pride. The ranch house stood solid against the backdrop of distant mountains, with corrals and a barn nearby. It wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but he'd built every structure with his own hands. It's beautiful, Sophia said quietly. Colton glanced at her, trying to detect any sarcasm, but her expression seemed genuine. It's serviceable, he corrected. Beauty doesn't matter much out here. I disagree, she replied. There's a particular beauty in something built with purpose. Her observation unsettled him. Few people understood what the Double W represented, not just shelter, but proof that he could survive on his own terms, without the entanglements that had destroyed his family. As they approached the ranch house, his foreman, Diego, emerged from the barn. The older Mexican's eyebrows rose at the sight of Sophia, but, to his credit, he kept his questions to himself as he helped unload her trunk. Miss Miller will be staying for a week, Colton explained tersely. Show her to the spare room, then return to the north pasture. Those fences won't mend themselves. That evening, after showing Sophia the rudimentary layout of the house, Colton retreated to the porch. The sunset painted the horizon in brilliant oranges and reds, a display he normally appreciated in solitude. Tonight, however, the beauty seemed to mock him. His carefully constructed isolation was being invaded, all because of some bureaucratic requirement he'd overlooked. The screen door creaked, and Sophia emerged with 2 steaming mugs. I found some coffee, she said, offering one to him. Colton accepted it reluctantly. You should rest. Tomorrow won't be easy. I've never been one to waste daylight, she replied, leaning against the porch railing. Your foreman mentioned you lost some cattle in the northern canyon last month. Colton's eyes narrowed. Diego talks too much. He's concerned. The losses sound systematic, not random predators. And what would you know about cattle rustling, Miss Miller? Sophia sipped her coffee before answering. My father lost everything to rustlers in Kansas when I was 16, before we moved east. She turned to face him fully. I recognized the pattern. Colton studied her in the fading light. You never mentioned your family had ranching experience. You never asked. She set down her mug. I'll see you at dawn, Mr. Winslow. As she disappeared inside, Colton found himself reassessing his assumptions. Perhaps Judge Morrison's interference wasn't entirely misguided. A wife with practical knowledge of ranch operations might prove useful after all, so long as she understood her place and maintained proper distance. What Colton couldn't have anticipated was Sophia's sheer determination. By the end of the first day, she had reorganized his chaotic kitchen, prepared meals that far surpassed the basic fare he was accustomed to, and still found time to mend a stack of shirts he'd set aside for months. By the third day, she had cataloged his disorganized accounts, identifying several discrepancies that suggested his cattle broker in Tucson was shorting him on weights. You're being systematically cheated, she informed him over supper. Based on these figures, you've lost nearly $800 over the past year. Colton frowned at the neat columns of numbers she'd transcribed. How did you learn to keep books like this? My father insisted I understand business matters, she explained. He believed an educated woman made a better partner. Partner, Colton repeated, the word tasting foreign on his tongue. He'd never considered a wife in such terms before. On the fourth day, while riding the property boundaries, they spotted fresh tracks leading into a narrow canyon. Those aren't from your herd, Sophia observed, pointing to distinctive markings in the dirt. Colton dismounted to examine them closer. You have a sharp eye, Miss Miller. Sophia, she corrected him. If we're to be married, even in name only, perhaps we should use our given names. He looked up at her, struck by how natural she appeared in the saddle, her cheeks flushed from the morning air, her brown hair loose around her shoulders. For a fleeting moment, he could almost imagine a different sort of life, one where he wasn't perpetually alone. Colton, then, he conceded, pushing the dangerous thought away. And you're right about the tracks. Someone's moving cattle through my property. They followed the trail until it disappeared near the property line shared with the neighboring Diamond Bar Ranch. Colton had never trusted Franklin Reed, the Diamond Bar's owner, but hadn't suspected him of outright theft. We'll need proof before making accusations, Sophia cautioned as they headed back. Perhaps we could set a trap. The pragmatic suggestion surprised him. You seem remarkably comfortable with frontier justice for a Boston lady. I told you. I lived in Kansas until I was 16, she reminded him. And Boston never suited me. Too many rules about what a woman should or shouldn't be interested in. That night, as they discussed strategies for catching the rustlers, Colton found himself genuinely enjoying Sophia's company. Her mind was quick, her observations astute, and her laughter, when he inadvertently provoked it with a dry remark, unexpectedly warming. By the sixth day, as they worked together to repair a broken pump at the Western water tank, Colton realized with growing alarm that he was looking forward to their conversations. When her sleeve caught on the mechanism and tore, revealing a small scar on her forearm, he found himself wanting to know its story. Each new detail about her life, her childhood exploring the Kansas prairie, her frustrated years in Boston society, her dreams of building something meaningful, chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses. Tomorrow's our last day, she remarked that evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Have you made your decision? Colton tensed. The week had passed too quickly. You've proven yourself capable, he admitted reluctantly. Such high praise, she teased, though he detected uncertainty beneath her light tone. The question remains whether you're willing to proceed with our arrangement. Are you, he countered. You've seen what life here entails. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. I find I prefer honest work under an open sky to suffocating politeness in closed rooms. She turned to face him. But I should be clear about my expectations, Colton. While I understand this begins as a practical arrangement, I won't live as a servant or a silent partner. I expect respect and a voice in decisions that affect our shared future. Her directness both irritated and impressed him. This is my ranch, he reminded her. And it will remain so, she agreed. But if I'm to be your wife, even in name, I bring more than just the legal status you need. I bring skills, judgment, and another pair of hands committed to building something lasting. The word lasting caught him off guard. He'd spent years focusing on survival, on getting through each season intact. The idea of building something permanent, something that might outlast him, hadn't featured in his thinking since he'd lost his family. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, he said finally. That night, Colton lay awake, wrestling with conflicting instincts. The logical part of his mind recognized that marrying Sophia would solve his immediate problem. She was competent, hardworking, and seemed genuinely interested in the ranch's success. But accepting her into his life meant creating a vulnerability he'd sworn to avoid. Caring for someone meant having something to lose. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard jolted him from his thoughts. Grabbing his rifle, he moved silently to the window. In the moonlight, he could make out 3 riders circling the corral where his prize breeding bulls were kept. Colton slipped out the back door, intending to circle behind them, when he heard the distinctive sound of a shotgun being cocked. I suggest you gentlemen reconsider. Sophia's voice rang out clearly from the porch. She stood in her nightgown and robe, her uncle's shotgun leveled confidently at the nearest rider. This ain't your concern, lady, one man called, his hand moving toward his holster. Colton aimed his rifle. I wouldn't, he warned, stepping into view. Drop your weapons. All of you. What followed was brief, but tense. The rustlers, recognizing they were outflanked, surrendered their guns. When Colton lit a lantern, he wasn't surprised to see the Diamond Bar brand on their chaps. "Franklin Reed sends his regards?" Colton asked coldly. The leader spat. "Reed pays better than you, Winslow. Man needs a crew willing to do what's needed." By morning, Diego had ridden to town with the bound rustlers and evidence of Reed's involvement. Colton and Sophia stood in the yard, watching the dust settle on the trail. "You handled yourself well last night," Colton acknowledged, still processing the image of her standing fearlessly on the porch, protecting his property as though it were her own. "We handled it together," she corrected him. "Which is rather the point, isn't it?" Looking at her in the clear morning light, Colton felt something shift within him. The certainty that had governed his life, that attachment was weakness, that caring meant vulnerability, suddenly seemed less absolute. Sophia had proven that partnership could be a source of strength rather than liability. "The week's up," he said quietly. "I've made my decision." Her expression remained carefully neutral. "And I'd like to proceed with our arrangement." He cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "That is, if you're still willing." A smile spread slowly across her face. "I believe I am, Mr. Winslow. One condition," he added. "This remains a practical partnership. We can't afford emotional entanglements out here." "Of course," she agreed, though something in her eyes suggested she didn't entirely believe him. A marriage of convenience, nothing more. They were married 3 days later in Judge Morrison's office, with Doc Miller and Diego as witnesses. The ceremony was brief, the celebration limited to a dinner at the town's hotel. When they returned to the Double W that evening, Colton showed Sophia to the master bedroom. "I'll take the spare room," he said, setting down her trunk. She raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "As you wish." Spring gave way to summer, and their arrangement settled into a rhythm. Sophia transformed the neglected ranch house into a proper home while taking charge of the accounts and supplies. Colton, freed from these concerns, expanded their herd and improved the irrigation system for their hay fields. They worked side by side during busy seasons, shared meals, and gradually, conversations extended beyond ranch matters. Colton found himself telling her about his childhood in Texas, even touching on the raid that had taken his parents. Sophia shared her frustrations with Boston society and her relief at escaping its confines. When Franklin Reed was arrested for organizing the rustling operation, Colton purchased the adjacent Diamond Bar land at auction. The expansion doubled their grazing capacity, and for the first time, he began thinking in terms of decades rather than seasons. "We should plant cottonwoods along the creek," Sophia suggested one evening as they reviewed their improved finances. "In 10 years, they'll provide shade for the cattle during summer heat." 10 years, Colton repeated, realizing he'd never planned that far ahead before. "Too ambitious?" she asked, misinterpreting his silence. "No," he said slowly. "Not ambitious enough. We should add fruit trees near the house, too, and expand the garden plot." Her smile warmed something in his chest. "I like the way you think, husband." The word no longer startled him as it once had. Somewhere along the way, their practical partnership had developed roots deeper than he'd anticipated. He found himself watching her as she moved around the house, noticing the grace in her movements, the determination in her approach to challenges, the intelligence in her planning. By fall, the pretense of separate rooms had been quietly abandoned. Neither acknowledged the change directly, but when Sophia moved her belongings into the master bedroom, Colton simply made space in the wardrobe. Their first night together had been tentative, awkward with unspoken questions, but their bodies discovered a harmony their words hadn't yet admitted. As winter approached, bringing with it the isolation of snowbound weeks, Colton realized with growing unease that his carefully constructed defenses had been thoroughly breached. The woman who had entered his life as a solution to a legal problem had somehow become essential to his happiness. The realization terrified him. He began creating distance, spending longer days in the far pastures, speaking less at meals, retreating into the solitary habits that had once defined his existence. Sophia noticed, of course. Her eyes tracked his movements with growing concern, but she respected his withdrawal, giving him the space he seemed to need while continuing to manage their shared responsibilities. The breaking point came during a December blizzard. Colton had ridden out to check on a pregnant heifer separated from the herd, promising to return before the storm intensified. But the snow came faster than expected, transforming the familiar landscape into a disorienting white void. When his horse stumbled in a hidden wash, throwing him against an outcropping of rock, Colton felt the sharp snap of breaking ribs. Darkness fell quickly, the temperature plummeting as the wind howled across the plain. He managed to secure the horse in the lee of a rock formation and huddle against its warmth. But as the hours passed, he felt consciousness slipping away. His thoughts turned to Sophia, her smile, her quiet strength, the way she hummed while working in the garden. He realized, with the clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extremity, that he loved her. Had loved her, perhaps, since that first night she'd stood fearlessly on the porch, defending their home. Their home. The thought warmed him even as the cold penetrated deeper. Somewhere in the swirling white darkness, he heard his name. Hallucination, he decided, until the sound came again, closer. And then, miraculously, Sophia appeared, leading a second horse, a lantern swinging from her saddle. "You impossible man," she chided as she dismounted, her voice tight with fear and relief. "Did you think I wouldn't come looking? How did you find me?" he managed through chattering teeth. "I know where the pregnant heifers were moved," she said, helping him onto her horse. "And I know you, Colton Winslow." The journey back was a blur of pain and cold, but Sophia's arm remained steady around him, her voice a constant reassurance in his ear. When they finally reached the ranch house, she treated his injuries with skilled hands, then sat beside him through the night as fever took hold. In his delirium, he spoke truths he'd been avoiding for months. How he'd grown to depend on her presence. How he feared losing her as he'd lost everyone else he'd ever loved. How the thought of her had kept him fighting to stay conscious in the snow. When clarity returned 3 days later, he found Sophia still beside him, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting she'd barely slept. "You're stubborn," she said when she noticed he was awake. "The doctor wasn't sure you'd make it." Colton reached for her hand. "Why did you come after me?" "Because I love you," she answered simply, as though stating an obvious fact. "Though heaven knows you've done your best to discourage it." The plain truth of her words stripped away his last defenses. "I thought keeping my distance would protect us both," he admitted. "My parents died because they couldn't leave each other behind during the raid. Their love became their weakness." Sophia's fingers tightened around his. "And yet, you would have died alone in that blizzard if I hadn't loved you enough to come searching." Her eyes held his. "Love isn't weakness, Colton. It's what gives us the strength to face impossible odds." "I've been a fool," he whispered. "Yes," she agreed, a smile softening her words. "But you're my fool." As spring returned to the Double W, bringing new calves and green shoots in Sophia's garden, Colton found himself standing on the porch, watching his wife direct the planting of the cottonwood saplings they'd discussed months earlier. Her confident movements, the way she laughed with the ranch hands, the vision she held of their future, all of it filled him with a contentment he'd never thought possible. When she noticed him watching, she crossed the yard to join him, her smile warming him more thoroughly than the spring sunshine. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" she asked, slipping her arm through his. "About how wrong I was," he admitted. "I thought the frontier was no place for love. That survival meant staying isolated, protected from loss." He turned to face her fully. "But you showed me that real survival isn't just about making it through each day alone. It's about building something worth living for." Sophia reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "We're building it together." As the cottonwoods took root along the creek, their marriage deepened, no longer a mere arrangement of convenience, but a true partnership built on respect, shared purpose, and love that had grown despite his best efforts to prevent it. 5 years later, as they stood on the same porch watching their twin daughters chase fireflies in the twilight, Colton marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The Double W had expanded again, becoming one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. Their home had grown too, with additions to accommodate their family and the community gatherings Sophia insisted upon hosting. "Judge Morrison is coming for dinner tomorrow," Sophia reminded him, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "He likes to take credit for our marriage, you know." Colton chuckled. "Let him. It's the one time his interference in my life turned out to be right. Only because you were too stubborn to recognize a good thing when it was standing right in front of you," she teased. "I recognized it," he corrected, pulling her closer. "I was just too afraid to accept it." As darkness settled over their land, Colton reflected on the irony of his journey. He had been forced into marriage to save his ranch, only to discover that what truly needed saving was his heart. The woman dismissed as an old maid had shown him that true strength came not from isolation, but from the courage to love despite the risks. In the end, the Double W had become more than a cattle operation. It was the center of a life built on the foundation of their shared vision, a testament to the truth that even on the harsh frontier, love wasn't a liability, but the most valuable asset of all.